Hi, welcome back to the Fools and Sages podcast. We're really excited to have today a return visit from Dr. Claudia Hauer from St. John's College. And last time we talked about St. John's and we talked about some classical philosophers. And we also started to talk about technology and philosophy and opened up some threads that we're excited to come back to today. So I will turn it over to you, Brian, to kind of maybe suggest where we might kick things off. And Claudia, so happy you're here also.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, I am so excited to continue where we left off, and it's great to see you again, Claudia.
You too.
Yeah, we last time we talked about St. John's and the role of dialogue and how fundamental that was to both the teaching and learning process, but also sort of to the history of philosophy. And I kind of think of philosophy as trying to figure out how do we think about things. And the ideas about how we think about things have changed through time. And, we talked about that a little bit in the last episode. And folks, if you didn't get a chance to hear the last episode, you don't need to for this one to make sense, but it will certainly set a context for that. So I heartily recommend you to do that. But so we end up with a lot of different things get churned up in this quest for how do we think about things. And how do we think about the question of what should we do? How do we use language? Where do we find meaning? Philosophy's looked in a lot of different directions. And this story is unfolded through time. And what we kind of wanted to look at today was a special area within the greater philosophical undertaking that deals with how should we treat each other, and to kind of drill down on what the philosophers have to tell us about our interactions. And I was realizing this past week that what we're really offering here is the counsel of the dead, which is to say, through this long history, all of these wisest people who now have passed before us, in this idea, the antepasados, those who have passed before, and they've sort of left this for us. And through history, they had this, what I refer to as the great conversation. So, Claudia, I know that you've had a special focus in the philosophers that really have made ethics a central role. And there has been this, what you mentioned last time, is a trajectory of ethical thought. And so I was wondering, can you give us some background to sort of get us up to date? Because a lot happened to get us here. We've been thrown into this story sort of partway through. So what do you have to set the stage for us on that?
Yeah, I mean, moral philosophy is born in ancient Greece. It seems to be born in the chaos and sort of collapse after Athens, lost the Peloponnesian War through its own hubris. And there seemed to be a kind of opening there for a kind of moral reckoning. And so you've got, I guess, in the 4th century BC, you've got like Socrates going around talking to people. And we don't really know much about that until Plato took it up and decided to write the dialogues, in which he's got a character, Socrates, who goes around and asks people about the good and pushes on them to the point where they are prepared to say that the thoughts they had about the good just don't quite hold up, and that's this notion of aporia, this notion that Plato's Socrates would bring everyone to a point of not knowing, right? But that was maybe what had to happen. I think Plato's student Aristotle is kind of the one I think of as the first real moral philosopher, because he put out that system. He said moral philosophy is needed because you can't rely on people's habits and their families and their tribes. You can't rely on those people to ensure that the values that are instilled are really good values that hold up under examination.
And,
And we
and
talk,
didn't
yeah.
he did he write that in a book to his son? Was that is that
Uh, it was Nicomachus. I thought Nicomachus was a friend, but I might be wrong about that. But
okay?
yeah, he was very much about let me help you. They're very practical. And then I guess unless we want to talk about the Christian fathers, there's not much more on the secular moral side until the Enlightenment. And then we get utilitarian ethics and deontological ethics, both of which I would kind of say are products of the Enlightenment, in which they're kind of like, oh, let's solve this problem by reason alone. And
Right.
they both offer what do you call them, formulae where you can compute what the right thing to do is. And so there's that.
Right. And so let's draw those two sides a little bit. We
Yeah,
have on one side the consequentialists and on the other side the deontologists, right? And the I guess would we put Aristotle in there with the deontologists?
I wouldn't.
Deontos means duty in Greek. And
It,
so those people in the deontologists, they just thought we had a duty to do what was right.
well, Dion actually means necessary.
Okay.
Yeah, I would tend to say Aristotle is more a situational ethics. He's more like, let's figure out the context and kind of work to find the moderate way through it. So maybe somewhere in between, where he's not a utilitarian who just wants to know what the outcome is going to be. And he's not sort of a Kantian who's like, this is an imperative, this is your categorical imperative. And Aristotle, I would say, is in the middle. He's like, what does the situation call for? And he even says in Nicomachean Ethics that it's going to be a calibrated scale. Like the mean for, say, generosity is going to look different. Like depending on how much means you have,
Right.
your giving is going to have to be on a bigger scale than the pauper who gives away their last penny or something. So yeah, I would put Aristotle, I would say situational, if that makes sense as a word
Okay,
for
yeah.
him.
And so the consequentialists then, of which the utilitarianists are a particular flock, they're the ones that kind of want to do the math
Right.
and decide what's going to who's going to lose the most, who's going to win the most, and how does it all shake out, as if we could be
Hmm.
scientific about it all.
Absolutely. Yes, they are. And I think for that reason, they've been both the most popular in the computational age, but they're also, I would say, the most vulnerable, but to be manipulated by kind of an AI calculation that might not really have human values as its ultimate principle.
Right, because we get some problems if we're just doing a basic math and we're not dimensionalizing it. The way that I always think of that is if we have one healthy person and we have four people needing organs, would the consequentialists say then we should actually cut those healthy organs out of that one person to give to the four people? Because then four people will live and only one will die. And there's various ways of these dilemmas have been drawn that I think we can create a problem scenario for almost any one of the.
That's basically the trolley problem.
I think so, yeah, it's a version of it,
Yeah.
yeah. Although Thomas Nagel brings up another version of that problem, which I wanna talk about later because I would like to address the question is, do we have an a priori intuition around morality? But keep going, so.
Well, your scenario is the premise of Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go, right? That was the Nobel Prize winner. That was his premise of there were it was horror. They would farm people they would clone people and farm them so that when the originals needed the organs, they could be harvested. It's a really good book. But my favorite example of utilitarianism is a little more simple. It's just that when you go to the doctor, they don't ask if you're a good person. They just look for the very best treatment for whatever you present your condition as.
Because they have a. I mean, I've recalled this dilemma in the war when a doctor is supposed to work on an enemy patient. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
well, now I'm supposed to save the life of this guy who 10 minutes before was out there actually trying to kill my countrymen. And
Mm-hmm.
so the consequentialist would say, "Psh, off with his head, right? If my countrymen are gonna be saved by that, or I mean, maybe that's not as clear
Well,
as some situations.
I think that right. That's right. That's when you would have a case where you had competing values, because the physical life even of the enemy is a good thing, but Yeah, so I guess that's why I would say I think this consequentialism is a little bit vulnerable. It's gonna if you really if it is a computation, it depends a lot on the data you put into the computation. And that might not reflect the full spectrum of the kinds of values that you respect and want in the human condition.
Right. Well, and I might argue that values live in a sort of a psychic n-dimensional space that that you can't do the calculus.
Mm,
And that's why maybe we have this
mm,
intuition. But there
yeah, yeah,
that might be the cart before the horse because I mean, Plato addressed this idea of what's correct is doing what's good to my friends and doing what's bad to my enemies is sort of presented, I think, by Alcibiades. And Plato sort of pushes us past that, which is almost a consequentialist kind of a viewpoint.
well, it's tribal ethics,
Tribal
and
ethics.
I think moral philosophy understands that you can't rely on your tribe to teach you the very most thoughtful positions about the human good.
I'm
Or like I
curious to
guess
hear more about that, Claudia, because
I think that's really relevant.
there's a lot going on now in the um, in various intersubjective spaces, where tribalism is kind of being promoted as a potential new ethic. I mean, it's an old ethic, but it's kind of like, the what some folks are labeling the woke right, for example, are saying something to the effect of the so-called privileged class, in this case, let's say white males in the United States, their needs and what's in their best interest have been overlooked at the expense of pluralism and looking after what's good for everybody. And that's resulted in immigration and in, all kinds of issues that have meant that they don't get the best paying jobs, and they have to compete for them. And why should they have to compete for them? This country was, you know I just want to emphasize this is not my argument, but this is an argument that I've been exposed to, unfortunately. And it just has struck me that, like, wow, that's a really antiquated way of thinking about things. Why is that making a resurgence now? What is this? What is the argument against this kind of tribalism, in terms of the good, for example?
well, I think one reason we hear all of these opinions blared about in public forums is just the way morality has been institutionalized. And again, I would argue moral philosophy itself, I think, would push back on the institutionalizing of morality or the good. This could bring us to a topic I know we wanted to touch on, which is some 20th century ethics that were developed after the Holocaust, when people like Hannah Arendt and others pointed out it was the very fact of institutions that enabled the mass atrocities that treating people like things that enabled the mass thing of the Holocaust. So I guess what you have in the second half of the 20th century is a kind of perspective in moral philosophy that wants to resist this kind of public discourse that I would tend to say, Boaz, tends to get very, very strident. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem to me to be philosophy, in that I don't know whether the people who who are loudest in the public fora, I'm not sure those people could really give an account in the way that someone like a Plato would ask for, of why the goods they're bandering about are the goods. Like, why are those really the good things, and are those the highest good things? Would this be a good time to stray into some of that, or should we build up a little more?
Sure. Yeah, I think I don't know that we can have this conversation in like a really highly organized way. At least not without a few semesters to go through it. So, yeah, I say, it sounds like you want to talk about the post-Holocaust ethicists. And I'd love to
Mhm.
hear more about that.
Right.
Yeah. Did you have something to add, Brian?
Well, I was just going to say that the people that I think we're talking about largely kind of came out of the school that we recognize under the name of the phenomenologists,
Mm-hmm.
coming out of a German philosopher named Edmund Husserl,
Mm-hmm.
and that the there was a shift in philosophy from having these big ideas about being and the order of the universe and deriving our ethical behavior kind of from those foundations. And with the phenomenologists, they're on the other side of this what sometimes they call an epistemic revolution, where people started to focus not on the gods and on the big metaphysical pictures, but actually on the human's experience and how do we know stuff. And the phenomenologists sort of they really wanted to drill down on the human doing the experiencing and the interpretation. And so it's these modern philosophers that have really sort of kind of put the microscope on that function. And particularly with Husserl was this idea of intersubjectivity, which I thought was a really interesting and fruitful term, which has changed its meaning over, you know. But anyway, that's just to kind of tee up what is phenomenology, because some of these guys are
Mm-hmm.
Hannah Arendt and Levinas and Gadamer, and a number of these folks came sort of out of that Heideggerian phenomenologist school.
Mm-hmm.
Just to tee that up a little bit.
Yeah, a lot of people who studied with Heidegger and understood the value of his method then later took that method and applied it to things that Heidegger did not. And morality or virtue or ethics, that would be some, I mean, as we know, Levinas famously said, it's hard to forgive Heidegger because he took the side of the Nazis during the Holocaust. So we have to tease that apart, I guess. Just they recognize the value of the method, but they wanted to do something with it that really had the good as its intent. And that I think is my favorite of those is Levinas. Now he lived through the Holocaust. He was imprisoned in Germany. He was not in a concentration camp, but he experienced pretty terrible conditions in a prison in Germany. He gave a lot of thought, I guess, both to how it could happen, that people could be treated like things to the extent that they were just turned into carcasses. And also, he then was in France during the Nuremberg trials and was giving a lot of thought, I guess, to there was this very strident call to bring the war criminals to justice, right? I want to let you see my fingers making the little air quote around justice, because what Levinas started to think about was justice is a political tool. I mean, Aristotle talks about this, right? Justice is a tool that attempts to restore an equilibrium that's been broken. So it gives the items back that were stolen. It asks for certain types of retribution, attempting to restore some kind of political equality. But Levinas thought that the crimes of the Holocaust were sort of infinite enough that he began to doubt whether the sort of enraged call for justice was really where you would find the root of the good. And that led him to the distinction he eventually made between totalizing systems and the infinity that he wanted to keep at the root of the real human moral relationship.
Maybe you could just explain real quick, Claudia, what totalizing systems are and what this reference to the infinite represents.
Well, I can't do that too quick, but yeah. But I was thinking about your point, Boaz. Like, okay, so in your model, you've got a certain demographic, right? You've got white men in the U.S. But I think Levinas's point is that as soon as you've got a demographic, you've got a totalizing system, because a totalizing system just counts up the number of people in that demographic. And then it can put kind of like there's like a boundary around that. That would be the totality, right? Like so that would be the basis, I guess, for the clamor for sort of a kind of political justice for crime. Everybody comes to the courtroom understanding that they have a political right to be there. They understand that they'll be treated a certain way by the court, and the court never needs to look at them as, I guess, as just as a particular human being.
And
Um,
I think it's interesting to point out that the phenomenologists, they really are drilling down on sort of the psychological habits that we have. Because I know Levinas goes in this idea of totalizing is really deep because it's actually about like a perceptual impulse, right? To wanna take this other
mhm,
and to
mhm.
crush it down into a little two-dimensional model that we can put inside our map and manipulate the way that we want to. So we do a kind of an injustice as almost as a psychological impulse. I mean, is that fair to say with his idea of totalization?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's totally fair. Totally fair. Sorry, but no, he says totalizing systems are necessary. Like they're not things we want to get rid of. They enable the political state. They enable his so-called history. They enable economic systems. They're not bad in and of themselves. He just doesn't want them to be able to serve as the foundation for the human moral relationship, which he thinks goes beyond those institutions. And I thought that was neat that you used the word other, because when he works on the human ethical relationship, he uses the word other, but he always capitalizes the O, as if to say, to encounter the other with a capital O has a certain kind of quality to that encounter that you're not going to have in the more transactional world of the totalizing systems. And you can just think of really basic examples, like I can go out of my house and talk to a whole number of people, but it's, I'm picking up my dry cleaning, I'm going to the grocery store. In all of those encounters, we're in our roles. Maybe I'm the client, whatever, what we know our roles, like I know what I expect from the checkout person at the supermarket. But with the ethical encounter, Levinas claims we're just meeting each other as human beings, and this is kind of where the infinity comes in, because there are infinite possibilities here. And I know, Brian, you had wanted to talk about discourse, but I think there's also something to work on here. There's a fundamental difference between the kind of discourse we use to transact and the kind of discourse we use when we're really attempting to meet another person as the other with a capital O.
Right, and that's that intersubjectivity that I think this idea started with Husserl, where it almost, and I know that that's gotten translated over the years as mutual understanding, but I think for Husserl, it was something even maybe a little more mystical than that.
Mm-hmm.
That the role of the other, even when there wasn't a particular person there, our perception is still sort of really entangled with the existence of the other. For
Yeah.
Husserl, I know, and I think these guys probably brought that flavor along, that we almost have a mystical interaction if we're in the right condition
Mm-hmm.
when we have that.
Well, and Levinas was Jewish, and so for him, it goes back to the call in the Old Testament to take care of the widow and the orphan, and those weren't, that for him, I think that's where his thinking, and that's, so I like that word mystical. It's almost a sacred. For Levinas, it's almost he actually calls it kind of a sacred command. I mean, he's doing secular moral philosophy. Don't get me wrong, because you can find these kinds of ideas in theology, but we're trying to write an ethics. These phenomenologists, they're trying to write an ethics that's going to function in the secular world. Like, you don't have to be of the faith, Yeah. Remind me where you were. There was something else. Oh yeah. So what is that mystic quality? Yeah. Levinas says, it's a willingness to be surprised. Because apparently psychologically what we do is we decide ahead of time what the person is that we're dealing with. We put them in a category ahead of time, and so nothing they can say can surprise us. But in the ethical encounter, we don't have a category for them yet, and we just are like, tell me about yourself, and what we hear can kind of knock us out of our interior expectations.
Right. Well, and
Um,
I have this idea. I've spent more time with Gadamer than with Levinas,
mhm,
and because I'm really engaged in that idea of the hermeneutical circle,
mhm,
this relationship that we have. We did some episodes about that, and so my model is that like the hermeneutical circle when applied to a text, you might say, I pick up the book, I haven't read it yet, I have an idea of what it's like. Then I read the first page, and now some of my ideas are changed because it's filled it in, and my idea of the whole text has changed because I've got that new piece. And so as I proceed through page by page, sentence by sentence, word by word, even, my picture of the whole is altered. And my picture of the whole is also the context that each new piece comes to sit in.
mhm,
And so when I read about Levinas and this idea of the other and the encounter with the other, and particularly Gadamer has this idea of the fusion of horizons, that I'm actually expanding my hermeneutical context through meeting this other person in a special way,
mhm,
so that my
mhm,
my mental world is actually expanded,
mhm,
my access to all meaning now, because every new piece of my experience is sort of hermeneutically referent to my experience of the whole. And so this my experience of this other person actually enriches that, puts more inside me to vibrate meaning out of the pieces of the world that I encounter.
Yeah, I hadn't put that together. That's very interesting. I just want to say for the listener, so I think Brian's referencing Gadamer's Truth and Method, in which he lays out his hermeneutics. And hermeneutics, he says, it's the search for meaning, and he names it after the Greek god Hermes, who would take the souls of the dead to the underworld carrying a torch. So so I just wanted to fill that background in, but I hadn't put that together, Brian. I think that's really helpful that what Levinas is working on is a kind of hermeneutics of ethical meaning, of really locating how our sense of the moral meaning of human being can just it could grow, like you said, it could just grow and grow if we could just figure out a way to encounter each other in this, what he calls, this infinite way.
There's a there are a couple of connections that I want to make. I think because I know some of our listeners are kind of in the business world and managing organizations, and I'm really interested in how this conversation has reminded me of some of the tools that are used in organizations to kind of contribute to improved organizational culture and things like that. So and in relationships, and organizations essentially are sets of relationships. So one thing is Stan Tatkin, who is a psychologist that works on couples and their ability to create effective partnerships, and he does that based on attachment theory. So secure and insecure attachment broken into avoidant attachment and anxious attachment. And he talks about the the fact that we automate one another. And that seems to me like it precipitated, consciously or not, out of this idea of totalizing systems.
Mm,
And in order to have an effective conversation with our partner, we have to pause our automation of them, which we can't control. Most of the time, we're going to automate each other. We couldn't possibly have the bandwidth to not go through life automating most of it. As you said, Claudia, we know our roles and we can't take the time to think through our roles all the time. But when we actually want to increase the depth and quality of partnership, we have to pause that automation and try to see the whole person and understand their motivations and their emotional content and the stories they tell themselves and where they are in their developmental trajectory and all this other stuff, the infinite of the other person. So that's just one interesting thing. I don't know if you're aware that this idea of totality and infinity has found a way into really like mainstream couples therapy. That's kind of cool. And then the other thing I just wanted to comment on is this readiness to be surprised. In organizations that have discovered that the quality of communication is actually the thing that drives innovation and that drives culture and that drives continual improvement and all the things that organizations are so hungry for, is curiosity. And there's one model that the Conscious Leadership Group uses, where you're supposed to check in with yourself and ask if you're above the line or below the line. And basically, below the line means coming from a place of fear or anxiety or anger or any other situation where kind of like the emotional content is in the driver's seat. And above the line all boils down to curious. And also from attachment theory, being triggered or below the line is equated with not having choice. And being curious is a product of having choice psychologically. So when we're not frozen, but we're in a malleable state, we can be curious and, to use the language that you introduced, not totalizing and open to the infinite. So I hadn't made those connections before and realized how mainstream actually some of these ideas are. Sorry to go on about that, but for me, that was a fun connection.
Well, and it's important, Boaz, that Levinas is not just theoretical, that it is a very practical model and very very enlightening. I guess I want to raise the stakes on that, though. So we're presuming, I guess, that the corporations are trying to do good in the world. So, but I want to go back, I guess, to, for Levinas, that he would add, I think, one more. There would be one more bar to clear, which is, it's one thing. It would be one thing to pursue the feeding of the orphan and the widow through corporate means, which would mean in our day and age, I think, moving goods and services around the world, trying to ensure that they are distributed to as many sort of countable human beings as possible. But that's still a totality for him. It's a good one. It's not a bad one, but but it's a totality. It's still treating all of the individuals within the, saying, oh, everyone in Sudan or something like that. Like, that's still a finite totality of people that need to be fed. But he would want, I think, to also hold out that there be some way. And he says these are both sides of these are necessary. It's not like we just have one or the other. They live alongside each other. But he would want some way that there would be a way of reaching the widow and the orphan that would just be, or the homeless man in Santa Fe or whatever, that there would just be some way of reaching that person with this infinity of wonder at what you said, Boaz, like just a kind of wonder at, like, this is a person with an infinite story to tell, and just like letting that unfold. Yeah, he was very concerned that, again, the Holocaust, how did it come about that the human being could get turned into a thing? And his conviction is that unless there can always be, and maybe this is unnecessary, because within the corporation there could be real ethical encounters. Maybe one of your colleagues it has fallen into very hard times and is in need, and a colleague on colleague relationship could transcend the totality of the institution. But he felt quite clearly that unless we kept that in mind, we were at risk of falling back into these terrible genocide patterns.
Well, and I think that what you're saying, just to underline it, is that this type of interaction that I suppose he would say is a truly moral, ethical relationship is not something that we are necessarily immediately accessible to. That we actually have to go through a process, a learning process, an evolution process
Mm.
to be actually capable of having those kinds of discourses. Like what I notice, and again, it came back to me, which we actually spoke about in our first episode, was the difference between rhetoric and dialogue.
Mm.
And it seems like often, as you were mentioning, Boaz, you see the messaging that's going back and forth, and mostly what we see is rhetoric. And often I'll see two dialogues or debates, more like, and what I'm seeing is two rhetoricians throwing rhetorical pieces at each other. I'm not seeing any dialectic, and nobody's getting surprised.
Mm.
I mean, is maybe the best way to say it, because everybody's sort of using nobody's surprised not just by what the other person's saying, but by what they say.
Mhm.
Like this type of discourse, I think it needs that searching for the right words,
Mhm.
that searching for the way to find the thing, or else we're not really fusing horizons, as Gadamer would say. We're not really bridging our cognitive models in a way that we're both enriched.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, and Levinas handles that in a beautiful way. Let the stranger into your home. Be, so as long as and it's a metaphor. I mean I guess it's actually literally true as well, but it's a metaphor. As long as I'm just at home, I haven't let a stranger into my home.
Hmm.
I would take it all the way back to like Homer, right? Like
Mhm.
the Xenos, the stranger was sacred. If the stranger arrived at the threshold, you must let him in,
Uh-huh.
and you would feed him before you asked, and then you would ask him to tell you his story. And Levinas is kind of like that too. He's so I think so I think that for dialogue, it's like let the stranger into your dialogic home.
Uh-huh. Which implies not having a certain type of fear.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. It's radical openness. It's
Right.
radical openness. Yeah.
Right. Which sort of brings me, I mean, I guess I come back to Heidegger, or that idea of authenticity, that we actually bring our that part of being in the right condition to have that type of discourse is you have to be in an authentic condition. And I know that for him, part of authenticity was recognizing our own death, recognizing that we're stuck in temporality, and that somehow, that's one of the reasons I like the Fools and Sages logo that has the skull on there, because something about that puts us in a perspective that maybe that allows the infinite in a certain way, or maybe that addresses the fear that's at the core of not wanting to let someone in your home. And I know one of these guys, they kind of blur in my mind, but one of them described philosophy as finding a way to be at home.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Wow.
and I thought that's really an interesting idea there, that sort of shows up, that there's that's an intellectual place of being at home, and that maybe if we really are at home,
Mm.
we can open the door and let the other in for a deeper encounter.
That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I think there's that would maybe moral philosophy for me maybe falls into two categories. The ones that are alluring or interesting to me are the ones that say, yeah, you might you might get killed, and then the others are the kind of utilitarians who are like, I am never going to do anything that might put me in any danger. But I guess, from a theological point of view, whether you're a Christian or a Jew or even a Muslim that would have this, There are things you are willing to risk your life for, and there are other people's goods that you might put ahead of your own life. I mean, I'm not saying it's a desirable thing. John Stuart Mill addresses this, right? He's like, it's not like I'm saying self-sacrifice is a bad thing. He says, I just don't think it should ever be the basis of the common moral life. But what you're saying, I think, when to let someone in, you have to take an enormous risk, and maybe this is, Boaz, your thing too, is maybe it's even just an enormous psychological risk.
That's where I was going, because letting the stranger in sounds awfully like something Carl Jung would say about the shadow, and coming to terms with our own infinite is a path to higher consciousness. And I guess I've always assumed that higher ethics would follow. So it's still interesting to me, ethics as a first philosophy, like letting the literal stranger in makes us more conscious of the stranger inside us, right?
Mm,
Um, there's a there's a yeah. I guess I could see that in either direction. Um,
yeah, yeah. I don't know much about Jung. There's one more big thing I want to put on the table before we get much further, which I think is also a significant factor in 20th century ethics. And that is kind of the dawning realization that we put the planet in danger. And there's this sort of new sense that ethics now maybe has to reach across into the future, into the as yet unborn. But it's very problematic from a classical moral philosophy point of view. The assumption was always the ethical encounter happens in the present, in real time, human on human. So there are no real models for like how we might explain our moral obligation to the as yet unborn. And I just want to throw that in there. That's not a Levinas thing. He doesn't, as far as I can tell, he doesn't really take that up. But I think it should be on our minds when we think about ethics in this age.
I think,
It needs to be a part of the conversation, I guess.
yeah, I think in Time and Being, Heidegger addresses that actually, and that his wanting people to not see time as a series of, before now, now, and after now, but to actually focus us more into futurity. And to me, I've been thinking, particularly because I've been reading Dewey lately, and he talks about how, and also because I've been listening to Federico Fagin, and how when we're in the moment, having free will, we the future is probabilistic. But the past is deterministic. We can do the math on the past. We can't do the math on the future. And so we're sort of, and this is why I'm so interested in a priori intuitions, because this idea of reaching out before the experience. And I know that he talks about this with the idea with the other that, um, and this is Husserl, I think, in intersubjectivity, this idea that we have to have these intuitions about the other, that even in nature, the other is present somehow. And so that just gets me feeling that there is a curriculum of intersubjectivity, and that it may well be related to this curriculum that we identified before of the continuum from dependence to independence to interdependence in the relationship with the other.
Brian, could you offer a definition of intersubjectivity? I'm not quite sure how you're using it.
Husserl brought it up originally. And this is one of the things that I thought fascinating, because according to Husserl, his idea of intersubjectivity, and I don't remember the German, he called it the most basic quality of human existence. And so to me, that's a good clue that ethics is going to be living right in close to that as as part of intersubjectivity. And that helped me kind of grasp Levinas's idea that we actually have an obligation to the other, that we are so dependent on intersubjectivity to make sense of the universe that everything presupposes intersubjectivity and the other. And of course, intersubjectivity, to define it, it got translated as mutual understanding, but for Husserl, and it did make it into modern psychology and therapy and stuff, as you pointed out, Boaz. Um, but I think it was a bigger thing for him than the way people used it later. And in other words, I would say that when we have a conversation, we're at one level of intersubjectivity. If I'm fighting with somebody, as you might know from Aikido, now I'm actually meeting the infinity, the unpredictability of that other person in time and space. And curiously, one of the Graduate Institute folks made a comment about our first episode where I had said that, oh, I think learning in person is better. And he said, no, no, I get so much out of doing it by Zoom that I would never get to that. And I was like, yeah, you're absolutely right that this does stretch our ability to discourse. But then I looked at Husserl again, and there was this part that I didn't understand even at first, which had to do with intersubjectivity being connected to the body of the other and the fact that that other body occupies time and space.
Mm-hmm.
And so, boom, then you're at Aikido, right? I mean, at least on that level of the unknown meeting the unknown, actually on a physical level. But my thought is because I wanted to go then always also to the shamanic experience, where by my baseline, the intersubjectivity is pushed to a whole nother dimension of being able to understand another person, which again, I'm just pointing to a kind of a curriculum, a progressive curriculum of
Mm-hmm.
that we really can push this intersubjectivity to places that we're not used to it going. And the reason that I bring this all up is because my suspicion is that a lot of the problems that are happening in the world, I suspect we need to learn how to talk to each other in a different way to solve them.
Mm-hmm.
And what's obvious from everything we've said so far is that for me to be able to talk to somebody in a different way, I have to be in a certain relationship with myself.
Well, that's helpful. Yeah. And and maybe I put the whole climate change thing on the table a little too soon because there's obviously no way to have a dialogue with someone who hasn't been born yet. This is part of what Jonah says is the problem with creating an ethics. But if we just bracket that for the moment, I certainly agree with what you're saying as a kind of elucidation of this kind of notion of the infinite possibilities of discourse that we're talking about with Levinas.
So I'm wondering, there was one thing you said earlier, Claudia, that I thought that provoked me. So we could go back to that, or you can take this in whatever direction you like. And it was that the Holocaust entailed treating people like things, or I don't know exactly what you said, but it was along those lines. And the provocation for me internally was that really the first time that that's happened, or is that really a story of human history? And if the latter, then is it just our awareness of it, or our expectations of how we think we should be better, that in the 20th century are relatively new? So yeah, I'm curious what that meant to you.
Yeah, well, Simone Weil has a lovely essay, The Iliad or the Poem of Force, in which she points out that the Iliad, Homer's Iliad, the epic poem, the war epic, that the men are reduced to things. So it seems as though we have been reducing, through warfare and genocide, we have been reducing people to things for a long time. I think the thing that stood out for Levinas with the Holocaust is the vast machinery of the institutions that enabled it. And that was the part I think that was so horrifying, was that people were just playing their little role as a cog in the machine and enable it. There, what Arendt calls the banality, right? The banality of it all. That was the part I think that came out of the Holocaust, was just how could this vast machinery of this huge organization, how could somehow every part of it just play along to come up with this evil on such a massive scale. And then I guess in the decades after, human beings are left with this moral vacuum of like trying to come to terms with how that could have happened.
And I
Um,
think to set the stage for that is right before that time, we had just had this marvelous mechanical revolution.
mm,
And everybody was looking forward to life improving because now we had all of this great mechanism. Now we had electricity, Thoreau talks about, a little earlier, but talks about the railroad and the impact it had to whisk somebody away at a speed to kill old people, was the way that he put it. And so I think that there was this instinct of, or an intuition of great promise, that this age of mechanization and I mean, washing machines and cars, and it's like life is going to be so good, and then boom.
well, and I think that's what we see with people's attitudes about climate change, is that moral people find the whole thing horrifying, but the idea of finding a way to change these vast mechanisms of the institutions such that a real change might come about, people just think, oh, that's impossible, I guess. And so a kind of fatalism sets in, or a kind of nihilism, that you're like, well, I see this horrible problem, but um
And could this maybe be connected to, we tend to see the problem outside and we tend to see the problem as other,
well, yeah, and I didn't mean
so that
to.
we don't participate in it, and so that what really needs to change is us.
Yeah, yeah, and I didn't mean to imply that every, any individual was somehow abdicating her responsibility toward, but I guess I meant, I think that is still a hazard of our age, and I think this whole artificial intelligence thing terrifies me for this reason, which is that it seems that a lot of institutional processes are now no longer even mechanized to, like, human beings on an assembly line, but mechanized to some other agent that's not even human. And that could, it seems as though if Levinas were alive, I think he would say that that could very well lead to the same kind of, and I don't think necessarily it would end in a Holocaust, but it could lead to some kind of another kind of giant horrible thing that.
Well, it seems like maybe one of Levinas's insights was that we pass these responsibilities up the chain,
mm,
that is, of morality, and what we really need to do is bring it all the way down.
right.
And then we end up with the conversation about moral courage, and where
Yeah.
does that come from?
Yeah.
Because I was meaning to suggest that everybody is basically screwing the goose.
Right.
That that philosophy isn't what we think, it's what we live.
That's nice.
And so that, how do we participate or not participate? What do
Mhm.
we, and of course, I love Thoreau. So the idea of there being the duty of civil disobedience, because we don't serve society like men of wood or stone, but as living human beings with consciences.
Mhm. Mhm.
It reminds me, I think this was in the last episode we did one-on-one, Brian, where the question came up about whether it's necessary to find the infinite in another human being, or is the infinite available to us in nature and in the environment, and even to the extent that I think many now would make the argument that nature is conscious also, and is an infinite in essentially every way a human being would be. And I guess I think about, and I spent 25 years in the renewable energy industry, Claudia, and have worked with a lot of people who were very motivated to be in the industry because of mitigating climate change, and with many people who were in the industry because it was growing and a good place to make money. And I think I left thinking that external activity is much less important for, let's say, mitigating climate change, or even more to the point, shifting our relationship with our environment from, I think, what Brian referred to in a prior episode as a receiving energy or receiving entity to a bestowing entity, right? And we want to make the transition from being oriented towards only receiving and consuming to bestowing and stewarding.
And stewardship. Yeah.
So as in order for us to make that transition, we have to go through an individual internal developmental process that's potentially supported by a collective process. And I have also come to the assumption that no external activity resolves our relationship with the environment, but only going through the internal developmental process does. And the only way to do that is me, myself, to go through it with as much integrity as I can and hope that others do the same. And maybe I take others' example in doing that, and maybe others take my example too. And there's maybe some mutually beneficial activity there that results in some momentum towards a new relationship with the environment. So policy probably doesn't do it, or changing the machine and the bureaucracy probably doesn't do it. Yeah, curious to hear your thoughts about kind of that array of topics.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we are metabolisms. We are, as these human beings, with the capacity not just to wander through nature and eat what it gives us, but to actually procure vast and move through space and time vast amounts of things that we're going to consume. I mean, I think we have to accept that the metabolism is real. It's not going away. But I would be interested, I guess, in adding to that, Boaz, just the piece of, I guess, maybe becoming a little more mindful of where has this food come from that I'm going to gobble up and then shit out later, like where has it come from? Because I am going to leave some shit behind, and Levinas says in the Talmud lectures, and they are a little more religious than his later secular works. He says, never take a bite of bread without recognizing that there is someone out there who needs it more than you do. So, and then I guess also just, so there's that. I also like this word stewardship. I like the idea that we return to an animated nature that we had pre Enlightenment, when nature presented itself as animated, and I mean that in the deepest sense of presented itself as having soul. And so I don't know how to put all that together, but I don't think it's either or.
See, and what I was inspired to ask is, do you think that maybe some of this is related to us looking for meaning in the wrong places, and basically making a big philosophical mistake and looking for meaning in stuff through the manipulation of the environment?
Well, my perspective from St. John's, having followed the history of ideas there through my work there, is these things did sort of fundamentally shift when Enlightenment science figured out how to create industry on this vast scale. And it's kind of like what you said, Brian. At first, it was perceived as having so much promise. The physical quality of life for so many millions was going to improve. Now I think we're at a much more vulnerable age, because now we recognize that that very industrialization has imperiled the biosphere. And so there's a new imperative, right? There's a new imperative to, it's not like we're going to unwind technology, but
Right.
there does seem to be the imperative that Boaz mentions. I do see my imperative to live life in such a way that my relationship to the biosphere is as responsible as it can be. And that's, I mean, I haven't bought my electric car yet. We do have solar panels, but I think even at a much more fundamental sort of Levinasian level, it would be, do you know where the food you eat is coming from? And is it coming across on a cargo ship from somewhere that, is this whole setting in motion, this whole, what Jonas calls these cause-effect trains, they're runaway trains, right? We have no control over them.
Well, it's like there's a cultural project. And I guess my question is the cultural project based on a misapprehension that are we still barking down the idea that the alley that domination of nature will bring on the fulfillment of all human potential, as opposed to uh, nature undominated, containing that seed of other that we really need to know ourselves. The one of Ken Wilber's first books was called The Atman Project, and it's based on the Hindu idea that what we really want is God, or what we really want is totality, which I believe Levinas would say we're only going to get when we die and we become one with God.
Mm.
But that somehow we're culturally, collectively barking down pursuing a certain project that's fallacious, and that maybe the cultural narrative needs to shift, and that will enable the cultural values to shift. Because again, I'm still interested in this idea of between rhetoric and
Uh-oh. Did something just happen?
Yeah, Brian, I think you lost internet for a second, so we lost you at
it could be
the relationship between rhetoric.
the relationship between rhetoric, which is basically telling people what you want them to think, and discourse, which is where we discover what we can think together, or a new thing to think together. And that finding new solutions has to happen in that direction, and sort of that if we're just using rhetoric on each other, there's no self-exploration, there's no movement, or as you say, there's no surprise, which I would translate to say there's no growth. If there's no surprise, there's no growth. And that maybe the ethical issues that we're facing, we need to actually grow out of as humans.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I want to walk back what I said, because I feel like I don't like what I said. I didn't really mean to suggest that there was an antidote. I mean, the first problem is to make sure everyone in the world gets fed. And it looks at the time like there's maybe no solution to that problem, but we did the best we could. I mean, it was this industrialization that seemed to bring the promise that we could move food around sufficiently that everybody would get it. Now, I mean, I think we face the kind of brutal reality that the very forces that we use to move it around have meant that they can't grow it there anymore because it's too hot, or so, or whatever, there's no water, or I don't know what the antidote is. I think a lot of this, when I read Levinas with my students, they always are like, well, what is he telling me to do? And I think this is phenomenology, right, Brian? Phenomenology is not prescriptive. Phenomenology is descriptive. And so the only answer that he can give is just go out there and notice that you are involved in totalizing systems, but also cultivate what you're doing such a beautiful job, Brian, of calling a kind of authentic dialogue, or cultivate that relationship with the other, cultivate that relationship with the biosphere as something that we want to steward and take care of. And it's like, it's not like, I guess that's what I meant by it's not either or. Like we are living in a terrible time, but at the same time, those capacities for what Levinas would call the genuinely ethical, those are still just as available as they ever were, if that sounds a little better.
Well, or maybe more available since we can have these kinds of discussions and that the technology actually maybe will empower discourse. I mean, that's my optimistic
Yeah,
viewpoint
yeah,
is that the butterfly is slowly assembling the parts out of the goo of the caterpillar.
yeah, yeah. I guess I just wish that everybody in the world could be fed. I mean, like that does kind of feel like a primary thing that we fail.
No, and fresh water. No, that's why a few years ago I did my first project in Africa to try to help people
Mm,
get fed
yeah.
in a direct way.
Mm, mm,
But again, this is the encounter with the other.
yeah. 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 Yeah.
Brian, you used a phrase a little while ago, moral courage, and it sounded like it had a capital M and a capital C. I was wondering if we could loop back to that and you could say a little more. And Claudia,
Well,
maybe
you
you
know,
have a perspective on what moral courage is also.
it was connecting to uh, Thomas Nagel gave a lecture at Harvard where he spoke about and this is kind of on the topic of what a priori intuitions do we come with? Like, how has life set us up to live it a priori beforehand? And he was talking about a colleague of his that had been in World War II and was sent to interrogate a collaborator with the French resistance or a collaborator in France that had collaborated with the Nazis. And basically, his job was get anything useful that this guy might have for us, and then you're gonna turn him over to the French resistance. And it was a foregone conclusion what would happen once he turned him over. Not a prison camp, a bullet. And so he asked the guy for the information, and the guy says, "Well, if you can guarantee me that you'll release me to the Americans and not to the French resistance, then I'll tell you what you wanna know, which would be useful to save a lot of lives." And so his colleague would have had to basically lie to the guy because he couldn't prevent his execution. But he'd have to lie to the guy and say, "Yeah, okay, I'll do the deal. You tell us the information." And then he'd go get shot anyway. And his friend, his colleague, was not able to do that. He said, "This is not in my power to make that promise," and he wouldn't lie to the guy. So, and of course, the consequentialists would say, "Psh, lie to him, bro. You're saving people's lives."
Mm,
But for him, and my question is, and I think that Nagel was even talking about this in that setting, I don't know that he necessarily knew beforehand what he was going to do, but he found himself there in the moment and he said, "I can't do this."
mm,
And I would say it's because he had an intuition, a moral intuition that was not necessarily reasonable. That is, he couldn't argue it to a consequentialist or a utilitarian. Um, and so I'm interested in what comes in with us. And it seemed to me that he didn't just have a moral intuition, but he manifested moral courage then. Because I'm sure that people weren't happy with him. In fact, one comment was he wasn't the guy for that job.
mm,
Uh, but that to me, that's much more realistic than the trolley thing, right?
mm,
I mean, because this was a real life situation and a real life and death result. Um, but so I'm interested in that idea of where does moral courage come from and what internal process is it dependent upon? How do we make people morally courageous? or support that process. Maybe making them is too totalizing. but but the idea that there is a process, that it is our nature to manifest a moral intuition. I don't know whether that puts me with Locke or with Rousseau. I guess Rousseau.
Would you say that that guy, when he met the collaborator face to face, maybe something genuinely ethical sprang up between them?
Which brings me to the question of the face.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess a lot would, for me, would, I think one thing that these kinds of moral philosophies can offer us is perhaps the peace of not tearing ourselves to pieces when we are faced with impossible situations. I would hope that that guy was at peace with his choice, even though the world reviled him. I don't know, but I think if we understand that distinction between the totalizing institution and this face to face moment of the genuinely ethical, maybe we can bring ourselves a little more peace, because the world is going to put us in these impossible situations time and time again.
And we
Not
may bring
quite.
the world more peace.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Aristotle has this interesting moment in the Ethics where he's like, why do we have regret? And it's like, yeah, wouldn't human life be a lot easier without regret?
Mhm.
But regret, he decides regret has a function, a kind of moral pedagogical function. We learn from our regrets.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Or maybe that means we have learned. Maybe regret is the prize of having learned.
Brian, what did you mean by the question of the face? And Claudia, it looked like
Oh,
you understood and maybe reacted to it.
Oh, it's a Levinas thing.
Okay.
it's a
It's
Levinas thing.
looking into the eyes of the other. That's the moment that he thinks this kind of spark occurs, where you recognize the infinite other human being.
Which is interesting because it just reminded me of, you maybe have heard the story of the bullfighter who went to work one day and was staring there, was in the moment where he's supposed to put the bull down, and he had this eye to eye moment with the bull, and he just quit. He just quit right there.
Mm. Mhm.
Famous story, actually. I think particularly if you have children, you have this experience of, here is this other that just came out of the soul pool or whatever. But here is now this other in a closeness, in a relationship that is definitely special. I mean, I've always felt that parenthood puts us a few clicks closer to Buddhahood if we do it with if we bring ourselves to it to any degree. Um, and because it is an experience of the other in an intersubjectivity that's quite unique. I mean, as a mother, for example, there's an intersubjectivity there with a child that's extreme. Yeah, and so and I guess I feel a similar thing with animals, uh, maybe around their innocence and around their not being able to comprehend the reality around them to the degree that I can. So you feel an obligation to that.
Mm.
Um, but Levinas really does a lot with the face and this idea of the encounter.
Mhm. He says it. He says it's an epiphany, which is a word usually used of the appearance of the divine.
Right. With the idea that the infinite is the divine, a la Descartes.
Well, that might be a topic for another discussion.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure that that's what he thought, and I usually kick him around the sandbox whenever I can.
No, I guess I just meant that that's a surprising word to use of a human face encountering another human face. It's an
Mhm.
epiphany. It breaks into your world as if that it was the divine.
Right, right. If you do it right.
Right. You have to do it with the ethical and not with the totalizing. Yeah.
Well, I actually wonder if that might be a place for us to press pause on this rich conversation. There's some questions and threads that have come up here that I would love to come back to. both about the environment and about intersubjectivity um, and more. But if that makes sense to you, Claudia, and to you, Brian, to kind of segue out of this and regroup before we restart, then
I think unless Claudia, is there anything that you think would be apropos to drop in as a final point on it, or do you think we're good? What do you think?
Well, I would just want to say that now this is the second time I've talked to you both, and both times I've left feeling shaken up, but in a really productive way. And I want to say thank you for that. I feel like I leave these conversations feeling a little bit unsettled, but I realize that that's exactly what was supposed to happen. So it's exciting. Yeah.
it's interesting that you say that, Claudia, because the initial premise for this podcast was when I was in my early 20s, I would go over to Brian's house and listen to whatever it is that he happened to be talking and thinking about that day. Sometimes I would have a question, should I take this job or should I build a house, or I'm having this relationship problem, and Brian might be more specific, but I always left shaken up. And um and when and, and so when we started this podcast, the idea was, well, that's probably clonable, and scalable, and it might be interesting for our listeners to have a taste of that. So I'm happy that you have that experience. I have that experience frequently as we continue the podcast too, and you've absolutely contributed to that.
Absolutely.
So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Shaken, not stirred.
Shaking nuts. All righty. Well, yeah. Thanks again. Yeah. Nice.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you both. I enjoyed it so much.